Hey, it's Chad Carter here with LearnHoloLens.com and ChadCarter.net. I'm glad you've joined me for the second part in the tutorial series. And this is making a bouncing ball to run on the HoloLens. So just to recap where we left off, we have a ball that bounces on a floor. Boom, boom, boom. And this over here with the HoloLens camera is a prefab that was in the Holo Toolkit that we brought in. So we brought in the Holo Toolkit last week. From the Holo Toolkit, we really just used this HoloLens camera. This script that's already there lets us move the camera around inside the Unity editor. And of course, if this gets deployed to the HoloLens itself, we'll be able to, this camera's hooked up to the HoloLens. So as we move around, we'll see the area and the ball will move, if you will, appropriately. For the ball itself, we just brought in a sphere. It already had a sphere collider. We added in a physics material. We called it a bouncing material. That's over here in our materials. And we left the dynamic and static friction alone. We changed the bounciness to 0.8, changed the friction combination value to minimum and the bounce combination value to maximum. So it'll have a decent amount of bounce to it. We did make just a material of red. Basically, we just add a regular material. We set it to red and associate it to the ball. And we added a rigid body, so with the gravity turned on, so it would fall. We also added a plane, and the plane we just moved to make sure that it was kind of centered underneath the ball, so the ball would fall in the center of it. And that is what we covered in last week's part of this tutorial. So if you are not clear on how any of that happens, not familiar with Unity, then definitely go check that out. What we're going to do this week is actually get this deployed onto the HoloLens emulator and then onto the HoloLens itself. Okay, so we're actually going to build this as a project and get it deployed on the HoloLens emulator and on the HoloLens itself. So let's get started with that. To begin with, we're going to go up here to File, go to Build Settings, and you'll notice by default it's set to PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Okay, we'll go ahead and add in open scenes because we'll need to do that. So we'll just add in open scenes, which will shove main in there, because when we ended up last week, we actually saved our scene as main. And so for the build settings, we made sure we add that scene, but we need to actually have this compiled for Windows Store and make a couple other changes. With the Holo Toolkit, I'm going to go in here and just say Save Project. But the Holo Toolkit adds in this menu items to Unity itself. And we can come over here to Configure and select Apply HoloLens Project Settings. And what it wants to do is actually reload the project so the changes it made can take effect. So we'll let it reload. And at this point, our project is set up to run on the HoloLens for the most part. So if we go back over to Build Settings, you'll see now Windows Store selected. The target device is currently any device. We can change this to HoloLens. I also wanted to create Unity C# projects for me. And so I'm going to select that checkbox. Then I'm going to select Player Settings. Now, if you're using a version other than the personal version of Unity, then you can actually decide not to show the Unity splash screen or even add in your own splash screen if you wanted to. Under Other Settings, this is super important. It's called Virtual Reality Supported. You got to make sure this is checked, and then the SDK that's selected is Windows Holographic. And if it's not there, you should be able to hit this plus and then select it from the list. If you don't have this at all, then that means you don't have all the tools installed that you need. So if you go to my website, ChadCarter.net, I have a link to the Ultimate HoloLens resource list. Inside that list, I mentioned the install tools. So definitely click on that link where the install tools are. And Microsoft has a document to explain exactly what versions of the different tools that you need. But basically it's Unity, the latest version of Unity. At the time of this recording, it's 5.5, and it's in its final release. But basically it's Unity, version 5.503, as you can see up in the top left here. That's the current version that I have, that I'm running as of this recording. But you want to get the latest version of Unity. You want to get the emulator. And with Unity, you definitely want to grab the Windows Store components. So that's what gives you the ability to deploy here to the Windows Store we'll be seeing. And of course, you'll need Visual Studio 2015 or higher. And for now, at the time of this recording, again, I would suggest 2015. If you don't have Visual Studio, do Community Edition. Any other edition will work, professional, enterprise. So now that we have set up our scene in the build, we've set these player settings, the most important one being virtual reality supported. The next thing we can set either down here under Publish Settings is all the capabilities, or we can come over here to the HOL Toolkit, go to Configure, and say Capability Settings. And in which case, if we wanted to have some of these capabilities, we can do it. So for example, we want microphone, spatial perception. If we want any webcam or for it to connect to the internet, we could do that as well. For most of mine, I'll usually start with selecting microphone and spatial perception. That lets you do spatial mapping. And of course, microphone is so we can talk to it and give it commands, our app commands, and it can listen in through the microphone. And by me selecting those, you'll notice that down here, we now have spatial perception and microphone is selected here. So again, you could come here under the player settings and set them directly, or you can actually set them underneath the HOL Toolkit configure and capability settings. Okay. Now that that's done, the next step is to actually build the solution. So we can hit the build button, and it wants to know where we want to build this project to. And I just type in UWP here for a new folder and select that folder, and now it's going to build a brand new Visual Studio solution into that folder. A lot of times in Unity, you could say build. For example, if I was selecting the PC, Mac, and Linux and hit build, it would make an actual executable, and that executable is your output. In this case here for the Windows Store, our executable is a Visual Studio solution that then can be built to create the packages and everything to submit to the store. Okay, so it's a little bit different than some of your others. Obviously, if you did WebGL, you'd have HTML and JavaScript and all that in your folder there. So when it's done building, you will see that the Explorer window is brought up with the folder that you typed in is selected. So that's UWP. And you'll notice now we have this bouncing ball tutorial solution here. That's different from the bouncing ball tutorial solution that's just in our main project itself. Okay. So under this solution is any scripts that I had that I would maybe want to debug inside of Unity itself. We're not going to get into that right now, but if you go into UWP, this is the thing we just built. And this solution, when we open it, it's going to open up Visual Studio. This is the solution that we can deploy to the emulator or to the device itself, or even just to Windows Store or your Windows machine directly. Okay. So the first thing you want to do when the solution is opened, and you'll know you have the right solution open because it says Universal Windows. If up here it says something like play in Unity or attached to Unity rather, then the solution that you opened was the main solution, not this Windows built solution. But the first thing we want to do is change ARM to x86 because the HoloLens is an x86 device. It's a 32-bit device. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit Control-Shift-B, which is to build. I could just come over here to the build command and hit build solution, and that would also build it. And so we'll let it build under debug right now for x86. All right, so it's been built. I can, if I want to, just say, hey, run on local machine. Of course, this is just my Windows 10 machine here. And it's going to register it. It's brought up the window. Bouncy ball tutorial. It's going to automatically go into full screen mode. And then the ball's bouncing in front of us. Okay. And that's it. Now I can't move the camera. You also know down here it says development build. But I can't like move my camera around or anything because that script that's associated to the HoloLens camera that I was telling you about, that works in the editor, but it doesn't work just in regular, a Windows build. So we would need to do or something else if we actually want this to work, not just on the HoloLens, but on Windows itself. You typically wouldn't want that. So either way, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I just want to explain that this is actually a universal Windows application is what we're running here. But we don't run it on a local machine. Instead, we could run it on the emulator, or we could run on the device, or the remote machine. And we're actually going to show all three in this video, this tutorial. To start with, we're going to go to the emulator. Now that I've selected emulator, and again, if you're not seeing this in your list, that means you don't have the tools installed correctly. So we'll hit play here on the HoloLens emulator. And it's going to actually launch the emulator. It takes a little bit to launch the first time. So while that's launching, I'm going to actually come down here and close out this Explorer window. And we see the emulator is now loading. It'll also have to load the operating system, and then it will load our our bouncing ball tutorial. So we see the shell has come up, and you can see down here it's saying deploy is started, and so it's going to start deploying this app to the HoloLens emulator. Now you can see that the app started and the ball started bouncing. And using my mouse button, I can start looking around and seeing, sure enough, that we have our floor and the ball bounced on the floor. So there we had the ball, what it was doing, running in the emulator, and came to the floor. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I'm going to hit the Windows key in the emulator to bring up the start screen. And you'll notice that we actually have the bouncing ball tutorial is deployed onto the HoloLens here. Okay. All right. So go back to Visual Studio. We'll just leave the emulator running. We'll go back to Visual Studio. We'll stop debugging this. And now what I want to do is actually deploy this to the device. Now if I hook up my device using the USB cable, I can simply select device. Or I can do it through the network by selecting remote machine. Alright, so I have the HoloLens on. I'm going to type in my IP address. And hit select. And now I can build it again, because this time I'm building it for the remote machine. And once it's done building, I can then deploy it. Okay, it's built. So now I'm going to hit build and deploy solution. And now it's actually going to deploy it over the network via Wi-Fi to the HoloLens device. Okay, now that's deployed over the Wi-Fi, we will actually run it on the HoloLens. Now I'll record that so you can see it running after it's deployed that way. And finally, I can connect the HoloLens via the USB and change remote machine to device. And I could do like I did before with build and then deploy, or I could just hit play and let it build and deploy to the device all at one time in debug mode, which means it's actually attached, and in theory you could set up breakpoints and stop execution. But it's built, and now it's actually deploying to the HoloLens itself. And so it built it, it deployed it, and it ran on the HoloLens. I'm going to hit stop. And that was using the USB to device. So what we've seen is over here in Unity, we're able to bring up the build settings, add our main scene that we're trying to deploy, or whichever scenes it is that we want to have in this project, in our scenes and build section by adding open scenes. We applied the project settings, which made sure it selected Windows Store. Inside of our player settings, we also made sure it selected target devices HoloLens and Unity C# project, so we'd actually get the output. In the player settings, we happened to turn off the splash screen. We made sure that our capabilities were set, whether we did it here or did it through the HoloKit menu. We also made sure over here in other settings that virtual reality supported was checked and that Windows Holographic was selected. We then hit build, and that brought up a File Explorer window. We opened up the solution. Once we had the solution here, we changed it from ARM to x86. We then decided if we're going to deploy it on the remote machine, which is going over Wi-Fi. It's a little bit slower, but can be more convenient, therefore you're not tethered to the machine. Or you can hook it up to USB and do it to the device, or the very first thing we did was actually hook it up to the HoloLens emulator, in which case it deployed over here to the emulator. We saw the app actually running on the emulator, and we saw the app running on the HoloLens after it was deployed over Wi-Fi. We didn't show it again when it was deployed via USB because it looks the same. You don't have to uninstall the app on the HoloLens to reinstall it. It will automatically do it. At the same time, if you run into any issues where Visual Studio is choking and it doesn't deploy correctly, then one thing you can try is actually go and uninstall the app first from the HoloLens. So hopefully this was helpful. This was the second installment in the tutorial series on getting a bouncing ball to run on the HoloLens, and as of this point we actually have a bouncing ball running on the HoloLens. It only bounces one time, and we are showing this playing in the world. And so what we want to do is clean this up a bit so that we want to be able to tell it to reset, if you will, have the ball reset when we tell it to. And so I'm actually going to close out the emulator here. So next week we're actually going to add in a voice command, so it can accept a voice command so we can tell the ball to reset. That'll reset and start bouncing again. So that wraps up this week's part of the bouncing ball tutorial. I hope this has been beneficial to you. Definitely let me know in the comments if this has been beneficial or if something is confusing. If you have any questions or something else you would like to see, I'll read all the comments. So by all means, leave me a comment and let me know. And I will see you in next week's video.